Okay, so let's talk about how to solve quadratic equations by factoring. I've got the steps over here to the right. The first thing you're going to do is get everything on the same side. The second thing you'll do is to factor. Third, you're going to use something called the zero product property, which we'll talk about in a second. And then fourth, you're going to solve for x. So let's look at this first example. So I want to solve this problem for x. So I'm going to get everything on the same side. And then I want to factor. So I want two numbers that multiply to give me -5, add to give me -4. Those numbers will be -5 and +1. And since the x squared just has a coefficient of 1, I can use the shortcut trick and basically drop those two numbers in with x's. And now I'm going to use the zero product property. And the zero product property is a pretty simple little property. It basically says, 0 ZPP, if you have two numbers, a times b, and they equal 0, then a equals 0 and or b equals 0. So basically, if you have a multiplication of two numbers and the product is 0, one of them has to be 0 or both of them have to be 0. So once I've factored, I've got this thing times this thing equals 0. So that means that one of the two things must equal 0. That's using the zero product property. It's basically taking each of the factors once it equals 0 and set them each equal to 0. And now we're going to solve for x. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides and add -1 to both sides. So this problem has two answers, which means it would have two x-intercepts if I were to graph the associated function. So let's look at the one right below it. So I'm going to get everything on the same side. It's already there. I want two numbers that multiply to give me -18 and add to give me -7. And those two numbers would be -9 and +2. And then you can use either the grouping method or the box method or the magic method, as we talked about before. I'm going to use the box. So I put 3x squared here and -6 here, my two numbers that I got with x's next to them. I'm going to pull out the common factor in the top row. Common factor between 3 and -3, and between x squared and x is x. So if this is 3x and this is 3x squared, this has to be x. If this is x and this is 2x, this has to be 2. If this is 2 and this is -6, this has to be -3. And I can check this, that it's 3x and -3. Here it is. So my factored form is 3x plus 2 times x minus 3, and that equals 0. So now I can use the zero product property. And then I would have to subtract 2 from both sides and divide by 3. Be careful that you don't flip this because that's a really common error. And then x equals 3. So this would also have two x-intercepts if I were to graph it. Let's look at the last problem here. So get everything on the same side. Now, there's a real temptation when you have a problem that looks like this to divide both sides by x. Please don't do it, because if you do, you're going to lose a solution. Okay? So got everything on the same side. I'm going to factor. Now, you may look at this and go, well, what do I have two numbers that, what? Please remember the first step in factoring is to make sure you pull out any common factors. And both of these terms have a common factor. It's x. So if I pull that out, I'm left with a 2x minus 5, basically undistributing. That's not factored. So now I can use the zero product property. X is 0 is one of my answers. X is 5 halves is the other. If you had divided both sides by x at the beginning, you would have lost this solution, x equals 0, and you only would have found 1, so you'd only have half the problem right. So here's the steps again. Get everything on the same side so it equals 0. Factor your result. Use the zero product property by setting each of the factors equal to 0, and then solve for x. So now, all right. So now we need to talk about the quadratic formula, because the simple fact of the matter is you can solve certain quadratic equations by factoring, but if they're not factorable, factoring is not going to be useful. So we need something that can actually solve any quadratic equation out there, and the quadratic formula is what we use for that. So you definitely learned this in Algebra 1, and you might have used it last year in geometry. The quadratic formula is up here. If f of x equals ax squared, oops, let's fix that. If 0 equals ax squared plus bx plus c, so and then x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And you're going to need to have this memorized. So there's any number of songs out there. I've heard it done to Frere Jacques. I've heard it done to Pop Goes the Weasel. So But you can look on YouTube and find like songs to memorize the quadratic formula, whatever works for you. Now, the first thing is, in order to use the quadratic formula, you need to have it in this form. So you need to have everything on the same side. So in the problem that we have down here, I'm going to move the 8 over to the other side, so it equals 0. So the first thing, get everything on the same side. Secondly, identify what a, b, and c are. And a is the coefficient of the x squared term. So a is 3. It's not 3x squared, it's just 3. b is the coefficient of the x, and c is the constant term. Now, if this had been minus 14x, then b would be negative 14, but in this case, it's a positive. So, first of all, get everything on the same side. Secondly, identify a, b, and c. Thirdly, plug everything into the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Now, these steps we're about to take are where people mess up a lot of the time. So basically you have to remember to do order of operations when you're simplifying this. And the order of operations means everything that's in the radical should happen first because that's a grouping symbol. So I've got negative 14 plus or minus 14 squared is 196 minus 12 times 8, which is 96, all over 6. So then I've got square root of 100 all over 6 with a negative 14 plus or minus in front of it. Now the square root of 100, in this case that's a perfect square. And square root of 100 is 10. So then my answers here would be negative 14 plus 10, which is negative 4 over 6, and negative 14 minus 10, which is negative 24 over 6. And I should simplify those answers. So negative 2/3 and negative 4. Now, just remember, everything on the same side, identify a, b, and c, plug it in, follow order of operations, and make sure you simplify the radical, and then simplify the fraction at the end. Now we're going to do a couple more examples that have a little more challenging stuff going on in the next couple of videos.